The wind howled through Dry Hollow like a restless ghost, tugging at loose shutters and sending dust skittering in thin, curling snakes across the cracked earth. The sun hung low and mean in the western sky, a red-hot disk blurring the distant line where parched land met a weary horizon. Dry Hollow wasn't much of a town. A leaning row of warped false-fronted buildings lined either side of the main street. A saloon with a sagging porch, a general store that rarely stocked anything useful, a jail no man respected, and a church whose bell hadn't rung in years. The ground was dry enough to swallow a man whole if he stood still long enough. Behind the saloon, in the scant shade of a broken fence, a small figure crouched over the stiffening corpse of a goat. Her hair hung in dark, matted clumps around a gaunt, dirt-streaked face. Sadie Mae was no older than 10, though hunger had stripped the years from her frame. Her limbs were stick-thin, her dress little more than a tangle of filthy rags that hung loose from her shoulders. Flies buzzed lazily around the dead animal, its hide punctured and stiff, but Sadie didn't notice them. She tore with frantic hands at a strip of sun-dried flesh near the goat's ribs, shoving the stringy, half-rotted meat into her mouth, chewing before it had fully left her fingers. A voice cut the silence, thick and mean. "Well, I'll be damned." Sadie froze, her hand halfway to her mouth, a strip of gristly meat dangling between her fingers. Clem Dawes, a broad-shouldered ranch hand with a face like sun-baked leather and teeth the color of tobacco spit, stepped around the corner of the saloon. His beady eyes narrowed as he took in the sight before him. Behind him, a couple of the saloon regulars drifted over, drawn by the promise of fresh cruelty. Clem grinned. "Little rats eaten from a carcass," he announced loudly, spitting a stream of brown juice into the dust. Like a dog. Word traveled fast in Dry Hollow. Within minutes, half the town had gathered. Housewives with spikes sharp enough to cut glass, old men starved of entertainment, and children peeking from behind their mother's skirts. Sheriff Dugan arrived last, hat in hand, sweat beading on his brow. He looked from the goat to Sadie and sighed. It wasn't that he had any kindness in him. Dry Hollow had long since bled that dry. But there was a weight to what was about to happen, a sense of tipping too far. "Clem," Dugan said, voice dry as the dust, "leave her be." Clem barked a laugh. "Ain't no law says a thieving scavenger don't get what's comin'. Town's got to set an example, Sheriff, lest we all turn to pickin' at carcasses." Before Dugan could answer, Clem grabbed Sadie by the hair and yanked her upright. She let out a thin, ragged cry but didn't struggle, her sunken eyes wide and empty. The strip of meat slipped from her hand to the dust. The crowd murmured a low, ugly sound. A few jeered. Old Mrs. Barlow, whose husband had died years before from a bullet meant for another, crossed herself and spat in the dirt. "Filthy little creature." "Teach her a lesson," another voice called. The sheriff hesitated, looking down the street, perhaps hoping for a reason to intervene. And then he saw the figure in the shadows, near the remains of a half-collapsed stable, where the walls hung crooked and the roof slumped like a drunkard against a post. A man stood watching. His face was mostly hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, its edges frayed, the crown dust-caked and sun-bleached. The man's coat hung like old canvas, shoulders stooped from too many years, carrying things heavier than they ought to be. Weathered hands rested on the top rail of the fence, fingers gnarled and scarred. His eyes, though, those eyes were cold, not dead nor cruel, but empty of anything that might resemble mercy. The undertaker, an old man named Micah Greavy, had seen his share of dangerous men. He squinted toward the figure, and the blood drained from his face. A whisper escaped his lips, caught by the wind and carried into the crowd. "Ezekiel Kane." The name spread like fire in dry grass. "I thought he was dead." "God Almighty. They say he once shot 4 men with 3 bullets. The stranger didn't move. He seemed carved from the land itself, a piece of weathered stone left too long in a place that forgot to notice it. But those cold eyes never left Clem Dawes, nor the thin, dirty girl he held by the hair. Clem, for all his bluster, felt a prickling at the back of his neck. He turned, meeting that unblinking gaze, and for a moment the swagger left him. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Clem, best you let her go." The air thickened, the heat pressing in as though the sun itself had leaned a little closer. Clem's jaw worked, and for a heartbeat it seemed he might refuse. But something in those cold eyes, a promise of swift and terrible consequence, broke whatever nerve he'd clung to. With a grunt, he shoved Sadie into the dirt. She landed hard, a thin line of blood blooming from her lower lip. The crowd's mood curdled. No one wanted to be part of what came next. Sadie didn't cry. She lay where she fell, chest heaving, eyes glassy. The stranger spoke then, his voice a dry rasp, barely more than wind through dead branches. "You'll not lay a hand on her." The word struck the air like a hammer on an anvil. Simple, final. A long, terrible silence followed. No one moved. Micah Greavy stepped back, mumbling a prayer. Clem glared, but his bravado was gone. The sheriff, sweat trailing down his neck, looked at Ezekiel Kane as though seeing a specter. "Ain't no call for blood, mister." Ezekiel's eyes didn't leave Clem. "Then see to it." A long beat. The sheriff licked his lips and raised a hand. "All right, folks, show's over. Go on now. Nothing more to see." Slowly, like cattle breaking from a fence line, the townsfolk drifted away. Some shot glances back, curiosity warring with fear. Ezekiel moved then, crossing the street in long, deliberate strides, boots stirring little puffs of dust. He stopped beside Sadie, crouched stiffly, and held out a weathered hand. She flinched, staring at him. A moment passed. Then slowly, she reached up, her fingers small and bird-bone thin in his calloused grasp. He lifted her gently, steadying her on unsteady legs. "Name's Ezekiel," he said, voice soft now, something human flickering behind those cold eyes. "You're with me." And in a town eaten hollow by fear and cruelty, a single, ragged promise hung in the air. Night fell heavy on Dry Hollow, settling over the town like a rough wool blanket smothering a fire. The last of the sunset's blood-red light bled away over the distant ridgeline, and with it, the scattered sounds of uneasy laughter and the scrape of boot heels faded into silence. Men bolted their doors, and women drew curtains tight against the gathering dark. Fear rode the air like a storm about to break, thick and electric. In the old church hall, a flickering lantern threw thin shadows across warped floorboards and faces worn by years of dust and hard living. The town council of Dry Hollow had gathered, what passed for authority in a place most decent men had long since abandoned. Mayor Finch, a portly man with a florid face and a widow's peak slicked flat with grease, stood at the head of a cracked oak table. His beady eyes darted nervously between the others. Sheriff Dugan leaned against a post near the door, his hat in his hands, sweat darkening the brim. He looked as though he'd aged a year and a day. Clem Dawes was there too, arms crossed, lip curled, still nursing the sting of being shamed in the street. The subject of their meeting huddled in the corner on the floor. Sadie May, hair hanging in filthy ropes, her small frame drawn in tight, like a starved animal waiting for the next blow. "Well," Finch began, clearing his throat and adjusting his belt. "We can't have it. Can't have no street scavengers set in a tone like that. This town's hangin' by a thread as it is." Clem grunted. "I say we whip her. Good and proper. Tie her to the post out front, and let the folks see what happens to thieves and scavengers." A few heads nodded. The room stank of sweat and fear. The sheriff hesitated. "She's a kid, Finch. Don't feel right, stringing her up like that." "Right or not?" Clem snapped. "Folkry watchin' how we handle this. You go soft, word spreads. Next thing you know, every drifter and cut purse for 100 miles will be set in up shop right here in Dry Hollow." There was a low mutter of agreement, and then a voice cut through it all. Cold, clear, like the scrape of steel across stone. "You'll not lay a hand on her." The room fell silent. Every man turned toward the doorway, where a figure leaned against the frame. The light from the lantern caught the hard lines of his face, the grizzled stubble, the deep-set eyes that had seen too many men die. Ezekiel Kane. For a long moment, no one spoke. The undertaker, old Micah Greavy, swallowed hard and whispered, "God above." Finch found his voice first, blustering. Now see here, mister. Town council's town business. You don't get a say. I ain't a skin, Kane replied. He stepped into the room, his boots leaving dusty prints on the floor. You touch that girl, you answer to me. Clem spat into the corner. Hell you think you are? An old-timer in the back spoke, his voice thin and cracked. I'll tell you who he is. That's Kane. Ezekiel Kane. Served under Colonel Hatch. Lost Creek Massacre. The name landed like a thrown stone in still water. Some of the younger men looked confused, but the older ones went pale. Men who knew the stories of that awful winter, the canyon stained red, the way Ezekiel Kane had walked out alive when none of his enemies had. Finch's bluster shriveled. That true? Kane said nothing, just let them see the truth of it in his face. It was then that the doors banged open again and a figure stumbled in, bloody and wild-eyed. Tommy Keel, a rancher whose land lay a day's ride out toward Split Rock. His shirt clung dark with blood, and his chest rose and fell like a bellows. They're coming, he gasped. The Bridger gang. Hit my place at dusk. Killed Mary. Took what they could carry. Saw him riding hard for town. Chaos erupted. Voices overlapped. Sweet mother of. How many? God help us. Sheriff Dugan was on his feet. You sure it was Bridger? Tommy nodded, swaying. I seen him. Clay Bridger himself. Big as life. That name carried its own weight. Clay Bridger, highwayman killer. Leader of a pack of cutthroats who'd carved a bloody trail across 3 territories. The law had tried to catch him. None came back. Some men reached for rifles, others for whiskey. Arguments broke out. We should fortify. Too late for that. Ride for help. Ain't no help coming. Finch looked ready to bolt. I say we pack what we can, head east. Make for Dagger Pass before they cut us off. Clem snorted. Run if you want, coward. I ain't leaving my land. Kane's voice cut through again. Flee, and they'll pick you off like rabbits. Stay, you got a chance. All eyes turned to him. You think you can stop Bridger? Dugan asked. Kane didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to Sadie. She shrank from him at first, but he crouched, slow and unthreatening, and pulled a piece of bread from his coat pocket. Stale but clean. He held it out. The girl eyed it warily, hunger and distrust warring in her hollow face. Take it, Kane said, his voice softer now. Ain't nobody gonna hurt you. After a long moment, her trembling hand reached out and took it. She devoured it in 3 bites. Kane shrugged off his coat and laid it over her thin shoulders. She flinched at the touch, but didn't pull away. Across the room, Micah Greavy watched, something unreadable in his weathered face. When the room emptied for men to fetch weapons and bar windows, Micah stepped close to Kane. Didn't figure to see you back in these parts. Kane didn't look at him. Didn't figure I'd ever want to. You come for Bridger? A long silence. He left a mark, Kane said, and there was something raw in those words, a wound scabbed but never healed. Micah nodded. You sure this is the place to finish it? Kane finally met his eyes. A man's got to finish what he starts. And that girl, no one else will see to her. Micah's gaze drifted to Sadie, curled now against the wall, Kane's coat around her. World's a cruel place for girls like her. Kane's lips twitched, a hint of the man he might once have been. Then we make it less cruel. Micah looked away, the old weight of too many graves heavy in his bones. I'll dig your hole if you don't make it. You won't need to. The undertaker left him then, and Ezekiel Kane turned his gaze to the door, to the dark beyond it, where Bridger's shadow stretched long, and the storm gathered. Night laid its thick hand over Dry Hollow, turning the town into a patchwork of flickering shadows and restless murmurs. The lantern light from windows and doorways cast thin halos against the dust, and the townsfolk moved with grim purpose, overturning wagons, dragging barrels into the street, stacking firewood and stones wherever they could make a barrier. Old rifles, long unfired and poorly kept, were pulled from closets and cupboards. A pair of boys filled empty bottles with lamp oil, stuffing them with scraps of cloth. Fear hung like smoke. Ezekiel Kane stood at the center of it all, barking orders with a soldier's clarity. Stack those wagons lengthwise, not cross. Gives M less to burn. Put the sharpshooters on the roofs. 2 men per side street. And leave the east road clear. Funnel M where we want M. Sheriff Dugan chafed at it. Now see here, Kane. This is my town. I ought to. Kane's look cut through him, like a cold wind through old bones. Your town's about to burn, Sheriff. Unless you want your people strung up like fence posts, you'll fall in line. Dugan's jaw clenched, but he nodded. The townsfolk listened. Men who might have once called Kane a relic, a ghost from a bloodier time, moved when he spoke. Fear made obedience easy. Even Clem Dawes worked without complaint, nailing boards over the blacksmith's window, though he scowled the whole while. Dusk slithered down from the ridgeline. The sky bled purple and black. The wind died, leaving a silence so thick it felt alive. Not a cricket chirped, not a dog barked. Even the horses were still. The canyon mouth west of town sat in shadow, the dark gap between the stone bluffs swallowing the last of the day's light. All eyes turned there as the night thickened. Tommy Keel, bandaged and pale, leaned beside Kane, cradling a shotgun. "They'll come from there," he said. "Always did favor the dark." "They'll come," Kane replied, voice low. "They always do." He checked the cylinders on his Colt, snapped it shut. Another pair of pistols hung low on his hips, his rifle slung across his back. He moved like a man who'd lived with death too long to flinch at it now. Sadie sat on the porch of the general store, clutching the small Derringer Kane had pressed into her palm earlier. It was too big for her small hand, but she held it tight. The coat Kane had given her hung heavy on her shoulders. The sleeves bunched at her wrists. Her eyes never left the canyon mouth. "Use it if you must," Kane had told her. "Aim where it hurts most." She'd nodded, saying nothing. There was no room left in her for fear. The town held its breath. And then they came. Out of the canyon, like shadows peeled loose from the rock, the Bridger gang rode in. No war cries, no wild hollering, just the steady clop of hooves, the creak of leather, and the jingle of bridles. 30 men, maybe more, each one as mean-looking as the next. Ragged coats, old cavalry pistols, knives strapped to thighs. Faces lost in beards and grime, eyes that gleamed like glass under the moon. At their head rode Clay Bridger. He was bigger than Kane remembered. Thick-chested, broad-shouldered, with a beard streaked in gray. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but his grin showed white in the dark. A heavy rifle rested across his saddle horn. The outlaw slowed to a halt just shy of the town's makeshift barricades. Kane stepped into the street alone, his shadow long behind him. Dust stirred at his heels. "Clay," he called, voice carrying clear in the night. Bridger's grin widened. "Well, hell, Ezekiel Kane, ain't that a ghost come back to haunt me?" Some of the outlaws chuckled. Others shifted uneasily. "I'd heard you were dead," Bridger said. "Buried in a shallow grave somewhere south of the Rio." "Been buried," Kane answered. "Didn't take." Bridger nudged his horse forward a few steps. "What's this now? You playin' town marshal? Gonna stand between me and my prize." "Ain't here for the town," Kane said. "I'm here for you." Bridger laughed, a rough, booming sound. "Thought you had more sense than this. You and me, we bled the same battlefields, cut the same throats. Ain't no law left between us." Kane's jaw clenched. "You crossed a line, Clay. That girl you left for dead, those families you butchered, it ends tonight." Bridger's grin faltered for the briefest moment, a flicker of something old and mean in his eyes. "You never did have the stomach for this life. Always playing at being better." The air crackled with it. The men on the rooftops, hidden behind wagons, gripped their weapons tighter. "Thought you died with the rest at Shallow Pass," Bridger went on, his voice dropping. "Could have let it lie, Zeke. But you just don't know how to stay buried." Kane raised his revolver. Bridger did the same. The night exploded. Gunfire tore the silence to ribbons. Rifles cracked from the rooftops, muzzle flashes sparking bright against the dark. The outlaws scattered, returning fire. Bullets tore splinters from wagon wheels, sent dust pluming in the air. Kane dropped the first man with a shot to the throat, spun, and put a second round through another's chest. He moved like a machine, precise, unhurried. A round grazed his coat. Another shattered a window beside him. On the rooftops, the blacksmith's eldest boy took a round in the arm, nearly pitched over the side. But Sadie was there. She fired the Derringer, the tiny pistol cracking like a firecracker. The outlaw aiming at the boy caught it square in the throat and dropped. Sadie's hand shook, but her eyes stayed hard. "Reload!" someone shouted. A wagon burst into flame. Another outlaw tried to leap it and caught a shotgun blast midair. The townsfolk fought with the desperation of cornered men. Bottles of fire hurled from windows, shattered against the ground, flames leaping up. The outlaws pressed in from the side streets, but Kane anticipated them. Every time they thought they found a weak spot, a rifle cracked from a rooftop. A man went down. Sheriff Dugan fought beside Clem Dawes. The big ranch hand, for all his bluster, handled a rifle like he was born with it, dropping 2 men in quick succession. Kane felt the sear of pain across his ribs as a bullet found flesh. He staggered, teeth gritted, blood wetting his shirt. But he kept moving. Bridger had vanished into the chaos. "Clay," Kane roared, "come face me." A figure darted through the smoke, near the churchyard. Kane gave chase. He staggered, bleeding, through the narrow alley, catching glimpses of Bridger ahead, the glint of a rifle, a boot heel disappearing around a corner. The churchyard gates hung open. The grass beyond lay patchy and brittle under the moon. Bridger waited there, rifle leveled. Kane stepped into the open. "Well," Bridger sneered, "here we are again." Sadie appeared at the edge of the yard, small and ghost-like, the Derringer trembling in her hand. "Stay back, girl," Bridger barked. Kane saw her, shook his head once, but she didn't leave. The 2 men stared each other down. "I should have killed you at Shallow Pass," Bridger said. "You tried." Kane rasped. They drew. The night cracked. Bridger fired first. Kane's shoulder jerked as the round punched through him, but his shot went home. Bridger's gun flew from his hand. He staggered, a look of shock blooming across his face. Kane advanced, pistol raised. Bridger reached for his knife, but before he could move, Sadie's Derringer barked again. The round caught Bridger low in the gut. He dropped to his knees. Kane stood over him, bloodied and swaying. "Ends tonight," he said. And it did. The gunfire had stilled. Smoke hung over Dry Hollow like a low cloud, clinging to the broken fences, the scorched wagons, the blood-darkened dust. Fire smoldered in corners of the street, guttering shadows stretching and shrinking in the wavering light. The townsfolk, those few still standing, edged from their hiding places, behind overturned barrels, behind shattered windows, from doorways where they'd clung to children and old hopes. The night was no longer silent, but filled with the ragged sounds of the wounded and the dying. And at the center of it all, in the open stretch before the churchyard, 2 men faced one another. Ezekiel Kane stood swaying, blood soaking his shirt and sleeve, his battered hat long gone. His face was pale in the moonlight, streaked with dust and sweat, a thin line of blood at the corner of his mouth. His revolver hung loose in one hand, smoke still curling from the barrel. Opposite him, Clay Bridger loomed like a blackened post, one hand clamped to the fresh wound at his gut, the other hovering above his holster. His eyes glittered, cold and mad, teeth bared in a bloody grin. Despite his wounds, the man seemed fueled by hatred alone. A hush had fallen over the scattered survivors of the town. None spoke. No one dared. It was a scene carved straight from the grim tales told in saloons and campfires. The kind of final reckoning no one expected to live long after witnessing. Bridger's voice broke the silence, rough and bitter as old whiskey. "Ain't you something, Ezekiel? Always thought you'd die fastin' a better man than me." Kane didn't answer. He breathed hard, his chest hitching, every inch of him aching. Bridger sneered. "You remember Shallow Pass? Course you do. I still hear 'em sometimes, women screaming, men begging. You rode with us. You fired into those tents same as me. And you think a bullet tonight's gonna wash that away." A murmur stirred among the townsfolk, those words sharp as knives, but no one moved. Kane's jaw worked. His voice came low and rough. "I remember everything." Bridger laughed, then coughed hard, flecks of blood painting his beard. "And her. The girl you fancied. Preacher's daughter, wasn't she? Annie. What was left of her? I reckon I gave her a sweeter end than the rest. Kane's hand tightened on his pistol. His breath rattled in his chest. That what this was about? Bridger jeered, swaying slightly. A woman you couldn't save? A past you couldn't bury? He shifted his weight, his hand dipping toward his gun. Kane took a half-step forward, and his vision swam. The world tilted, the fires flickering like candle flames in a breeze. Pain clawed at his side, hot and wet. From the corner of his vision, movement. A small shape, slight as a shadow, darting forward. Sadie. She'd crept close while the men faced off. The tiny derringer gripped white-knuckled in both hands, her eyes bright with terror and fury. "Stay back," Kane rasped, his voice more plea than command. But the girl didn't hesitate. As Bridger's fingers brushed the grip of his revolver, Sadie's small pistol barked, a sharp crack in the tense night. The shot struck Bridger high in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around, the larger man stumbling. He let out a howl of rage, his hand still fumbling for his weapon, but too late. Kane's Colt came up, steady despite the tremor in his bloodied arm. He fired once. The shot caught Bridger square in the heart. For a long, eternal second, Bridger stayed upright, his expression twisted, shock, hate, and something darker flickering across his face. Then his knees buckled, and he crumpled into the dust. Silence. Kane stood over the body, shoulders sagging, blood streaming down his side. The world around him seemed to fall away. He could hear the crackle of nearby fire, the distant cry of an injured horse, a baby whimpering somewhere in the dark. But none of it touched him. Sadie ran to him, dropping the derringer in the dirt. She grabbed his hand, tugging at his coat, her voice tight and breaking. "Pa, you did it." The word hit him harder than any bullet. He looked down at her, her face streaked with soot and tears, her eyes the same shade of storm-dark blue as another girl long dead. He reached out with a trembling hand, cupping the back of her head, pulling her against him. His knees buckled, and together they sank to the ground. The townsfolk gathered, slowly at first, drawn by the finality of it. Sheriff Dugan came forward, his face pale, his badge darkened by sweat and soot. Micah Greavy, the undertaker, knelt beside Kane, his old hands checking the wound. "Bad one," Micah muttered, shaking his head. Kane coughed, a thread of blood at his lips. "Ain't my first." Sadie clung to him, tears cutting clean tracks down her dirt-streaked face. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me." Kane managed a weak, crooked smile. "Ain't planning to." The townsfolk stood in awkward silence, shame and gratitude wrestling in their faces. Micah leaned close. "Is it done, Zeke? Is it finished now?" Kane's eyes flickered. He drew a breath, shallow and ragged. Not Ezekiel," he whispered. Micah frowned. "What's that?" Sadie's head lifted, confusion in her tear-rimmed eyes. Kane's voice dropped to a hoarse rasp, barely audible. "Wasn't me, wasn't him. Ezekiel died at Shallow Pass." Micah stiffened. "Then who in the hell are you?" A faint, bitter smile tugged at Kane's bloodied lips. "Name's Elijah. His twin. Schoolteacher down south. Took his name after Bridger." He swallowed hard, pain tightening his features. "Some men ain't meant to live quiet. I wasn't him, but someone had to finish it." Micah stared, thunderstruck. Elijah's gaze turned to Sadie. "You stay strong, girl. Don't let him turn you mean." Sadie's small hands gripped his harder, her lips trembling. "I won't. I promise, Pa." Micah's throat tightened. He cleared it roughly. "I'll see he's buried proper, under his real name." Elijah managed a small nod. "Doesn't matter. Name don't matter now." His eyes drifted skyward, toward the gray-smudged dawn beginning to bleed into the night's edge. A long, shuddering breath escaped him. Then he was still. Sadie buried her face against his chest, sobbing. Micah placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. The undertaker looked out at the broken town, at the soot-streaked faces of the people who'd hidden while a stranger fought their battle. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Every man carries his ghosts," Micah said. "Some wear 'em on their skin. Others bury 'em deep. And some Some come back from the grave just long enough to finish what should have never been started. No one spoke. The fires burned lower. The wind began to rise again, carrying away the last of the gunsmoke. In time, the legend would grow of Ezekiel Kane, the deathless gunman, who came back from the shadows to settle a blood debt and save a broken town. Few would speak of the quiet schoolteacher named Elijah, or the girl with storm-dark eyes who called him Pa. But in Dry Hollow, where the dust kept old sins buried and new blood fresh in the soil, those who lived would remember. The dawn came slow and heavy over Dry Hollow, the first light bleeding pale over the ridgelines, like a wound across the earth. Mist clung low to the valley, stirring like old ghosts in the cool air. The fires from the night before had long since guttered out, leaving behind charred timbers, the sour stench of burnt wood, and the grim evidence of where men had fallen. They buried him on a rise just beyond the edge of town, where the land sloped gently down toward the valley, overlooking the patch of earth he died to defend. The grave was shallow, the stones gathered in a rough circle around it. There were no words carved into a headstone, only a plain wooden marker, weathered already by dust and sun, bearing a single hand-carved name, Ezekiel Kane. The lie remained, for the legend mattered now more than the truth. A gathering of townsfolk stood in a loose knot around the grave, hats in hand, eyes downcast. There were no sermons, no preacher to speak of salvation or grace. Sheriff Dugan was there, his badge tarnished, face lined with guilt. Clem Dawes came too, shame clinging to him heavier than the dust on his boots. Even the undertaker, Micah Greavy, held his hat to his chest, his face unreadable. But it was Sadie who spoke. She stepped forward alone, a slight figure in a dress too big for her, Kane's battered hat resting on her head. The morning light caught in her uncombed hair, the pale strands glinting like a halo, though her face was sharp with grief and resolve. The Derringer Kane had given her hung at her side, and she gripped it like it was a piece of him she wasn't ready to let go. Her voice, when it came, was raw, cracked from weeping, but clear enough to carry through the chill dawn. "He wasn't my blood," she said. "Didn't have to take me in. Didn't have to fight for a place like this, the place where folks wouldn't so much as spit on you if you were dying. But he did." The townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, shame thick as the mist. "I don't reckon I'll ever know what kind of man he was before, or what happened to make him carry so much sorrow. But I know what he did here, and I'll remember, so long as there's breath in me." She reached up, removing the old hat and laying it gently atop the marker. "I'll keep your word," she promised, "and I'll make sure they remember. Not just your name, but what it means." Sadie stepped back then, shoulders squared, and no one present missed how she changed. No longer the half-starved scavenger child, but something forged in fire and blood. The burial was done without further words. Men took their hats off, women wiped at their eyes, and the earth was laid over the grave. A pair of hawks circled overhead as the sun climbed, their cries sharp and clean against the new day. Life in Dry Hollow did not return to what it had been. It couldn't. Sheriff Dugan, humbled and newly aware of what cowardice had made of his badge, gathered a posse within days. Clem Dawes rode with him. The remaining cutthroats from Bridges' gang, those who'd fled into the hills when the tide turned, were hunted down one by one, their names scratched off the ledgers of the living. No quarter was given. The town council met beneath the old church bell for the first time in years. They voted to appoint Dugan's deputy, a younger, sharper man with no taste for cruelty, and rebuilt the jail with stones instead of rotten wood. And Sadie, the blacksmith, a thick-armed, kind-eyed man named Will Carver, and his wife, Hester, took her in. Hester taught her to read, placing a book in one hand and a rifle in the other. "One makes you wise," she told Sadie, "and the other keeps fools from taking what you've earned." Sadie proved quick with both. Rumors, as they do on the frontier, began to spread. Ezekiel Kane's final stand grew in the telling. It was said he faced 50 men alone, that bullets bounced from his chest like rain off stone, that he could shoot the wings off a fly at 100 paces. Dime novels carried his legend east, where city folk marveled at tales of the ghostly gunman who avenged the innocent and vanished into the dust. A traveling writer came through Dry Hollow months later, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a hunger for stories. He spoke to Micah Greavy, bought whiskey for Sheriff Dugan, and sat quietly at Kane's grave for a long hour. What he wrote down became a book sold for 10 cents in towns all the way to Dodge City. The Last Ride of Ezekiel Kane. It wasn't true, not in the details, but it carried something of the man who'd stood in the street that night, bleeding, unyielding. The years passed. Dry Hollow mended itself, but it never forgot. Children grew up hearing of the night Bridger's gang came, and of the man who saved them all. Sadie grew too. Her frame filled out, her hands hardened from work at the forge and long hours on the range. She rode as well as any man, shot better than most, and kept Kane's Derringer in her pocket even after she'd taken up a proper rifle. And one day, as dawn broke much like the one Kane had died beneath, Sadie returned to that lonely hilltop. She was 16 now, lean and sharp-eyed, a battered Winchester resting across her shoulder. Her hair was clean and combed, tied back with a strip of faded red cloth. The valley below was green with spring grass, the air clean, the town rebuilt. She knelt by the simple marker, fingers brushing the hat still hanging from its peg. "Morning, Pa," she said softly. A hawk's cry echoed from the cliffs. The world was wide and quiet. "They came through last week," she told him. "A pair of highwaymen. Thought to take what they pleased. I buried one of 'em. The other, he's got a limp now. Told him to spread the word. Dry Hollow ain't for the talking." She smiled a little, something fierce and proud. "I reckon you'd like that." A breeze stirred the grass. The clouds stretched thin against the pale blue. "I still carry your name," she said. "Folks round here, they know whose girl I am, and I don't let 'em forget it." Sadie rose then, the rifle easy in her grip, and turned to look down over the valley. The town below bustled with life, wagons rolling, children chasing dogs, smoke rising from chimneys. It wasn't perfect, never would be, but it was theirs. And as she stood there, a voice came, soft as memory, the voice of Micah Greavy long dead, carrying across the years like a line in an old sermon. In the unforgiving lands of the frontier, legends don't die. They rise in the hearts of those left behind. Sadie tipped the brim of her hat, turned toward the dawn, and walked down the hill, ready to take her place among them.